God warriors don't quit. Disclaimer, I am not a God warrior, and I am not really what you would consider religious in the traditional sense. Neither do I believe in an old man with a beard sitting on a cloud who is judging people. I just use the phrase God warriors don't quit to get your attention, but it is relevant to today's topic. So I have logically and psychologically figured out how religion can help you behave more effectively in life. Now, trust me, I'm not some wacky Christian. However, I did look into religion because it seemed so successful for previous generations and it has existed for thousands of years. So I thought, broski, there must be something that is of utility inside, or it cannot all be bullshit. There must be something that kept it alive for so long. It must somehow be useful. So I looked into it. And when you understand the logical, objective concept of God, your mind changes and so does your behavior. You stop quitting and giving up on things in your life, and you start to behave more nobly. And that is the topic of today's video. Why, if you understand God or the logical concept of God, you stop quitting and you stop giving up. So when I talk about the logical concept of God, I mean the following. It seems to me that there is an underlying structure in reality, or some sort of universal law that dictates how you get rewarded or punished according to your behavior. So some behaviors are good and some behaviors are bad. And some behaviors are good because you get rewarded positively, and some behaviors are bad because you get punished for them accordingly, so you suffer more. And that means there are some behaviors that are more beneficial to your life than others. There are some behaviors that make you suffer more than others. And when you understand this, you start to evaluate behaviors carefully. You don't overanalyze them and become sort of hypersensitive and hyper self-conscious, but you become conscious of different behaviors' consequences. And you evaluate the consequences based on whether they produce additional suffering in your life and suffering in the lives of the people around you or not, and whether they contribute to a state of good or contribute to a state of bad. And these states, what these good and bad states specifically entail, I'm not certain, and it would take quite long to discuss it. I've done it in other videos, I think, where I discuss suffering and etc. But it is obvious to me that some behaviors produce more suffering than others, and obviously you would want to behave in a way that produces less unnecessary suffering. When I mean unnecessary suffering, I mean, an aspect of life is tragic and suffering is inherent, but you can actually produce unnecessary suffering which doesn't really help you and actually just makes you miserable in your life. Now, when you become conscious of constructively figuring out what behavior would be noble, you start to understand how you should behave and what behavior, if everybody acted in such a way, would reduce people's suffering, and how would you want to be treated? You start asking these questions and figuring out how to behave. Now, what I noticed, and this is sort of the punchline of today's video, is that when taking the concept of God into account, I noticed that giving up and quitting on things is not the right path to take because it produces more suffering. Or let's say it doesn't reduce suffering. And I mean giving up in different kinds of scenarios, but especially in regards to dealing and handling other humans like your family and friends. You should never really give up. Well, let's say you should mostly never give up on other people like your friends and family, because if you give up on them, then you will not change their behavior into a better kind of behavior. You will not help them become healthier. You will not be able to reduce their suffering. You will not be able to help them to learn and become more clever. You should just not give up on them, because what you do is you just block the potential for them to grow and transcend their suffering. You just cut it down, and they will continue to dwell in their suffering then. Now, this behavior of not giving up and not quitting is tied into taking voluntary sacrifices and suffering upon yourself, just like Jesus did. Now, Jesus voluntarily took the sins and hence the suffering of the humanity upon himself and thus redeemed the world. And Jesus is an archetypal figure for humans, and he represents a kind of role model. And humans can emulate his behavior in order to reduce their suffering. And I believe during medieval times, this concept was quite prominent, that humans considered Jesus' life to be like the pattern that they aimed to emulate. And this was the most valuable endeavor to really set out on in life, to try and copy his life. Now, back to not giving up. I internally feel like I'm supposed to go this extra mile now. Even if at first my ego and emotions have been hurt by somebody, I'm supposed to continue fighting. Example, let's say your mother, your father, your brother or your sister says something insulting to you. Your first response is to throw an insult back at them, storm off, steal their car keys and drive off and never return home again. That's sort of the first impression you have after being insulted. But now I know that this is not the constructive way to solve problems. You do not solve problems by shutting other people down, insulting them, or never talking to them again. You need to understand that they are, first of all, they are themselves hurt, and otherwise they wouldn't lash out at you. Hurt people, and you give up on them by lashing back out at them. That's not the constructive way to solve a problem. And the noble thing would be to show patience and understanding, try to comfort them and give them space, and don't hurt them back. And this is a big misconception people have nowadays in the realm of conflicts. Like, you don't solve conflicts by exploiting or bashing your opponent. You solve it by trying to understand them and showing empathy, because that creates like a society where everybody benefits and everybody tries to aim for win-win situations, and you pull the aggregate level of well-being upwards instead of just fighting for yourself and exploiting others for your own benefit. And when someone insults you, the noble reaction would be to take the hit and continue treating them kindly. It's like you're relentlessly taking the responsibility for what happened and still continuing to trudge through the suffering. You voluntarily choose to take the responsibility. That is noble. That is how you solve society's problems. And I think religion was constructed in a way to help guide humans towards progress in society and a reduction of suffering, and try to innovate and just aim towards a positive trajectory, really. And that's why following some Christian or religious teachings is really beneficial. And when you bash people back because you bash them, you simply prolong the pain and suffering experienced by them and yourself. Someone needs to take the role of cutting the vicious cycle between you and your opponent. And this is what God and religion exemplifies, I think. And that's why God warriors don't quit and give up on people. Whatever a God warrior is, I'm just saying, like, somebody who understands the logical concept of God. And what I've learned myself is that I've become more understanding when people get angry and hand out insults. It's because they are hurt themselves. Logically, we should try to fix that pain within them, and you definitely don't do that by giving up on them, pushing them away, and you solve it by caring for them, even if they hurt you. Like, you need to persist and have faith that sticking through and persisting is the right thing to do. And it's voluntarily taking the suffering upon yourself, like almost the responsibility for the conflict, like you take upon yourself. Because when you take responsibility for it, you're actually able to solve it. Because if you don't take responsibility, you won't try to solve it, because it's not your problem then. And this is the behavior that persisting is the behavior that nudges the world towards a state of good and away from a state of bad. And this knowledge only really came to me because I looked into Christianity and the concept of God. And knowing this wisdom makes me feel calmer. It makes me feel more peaceful, like I feel more mature. The benefit of this is that I am more persistent during times of struggle. I know that quitting would be the easy and actually morally wrong thing to do, and persisting would be the noble, the strong, the heroic thing to do, whether it is at work, whether it is during studying or dealing with friends and family. And it's I think this is what people talk about when they use the word faith. It's a kind of faith, I think. Like, you take a leap of faith that persisting and not giving up will produce a valuable, peaceful outcome. You have no insurance that sticking through the struggle will actually offer you the desirable outcome, but that is God, I think, again. Like, when you persist, you follow this underlying governing structure of reality, of the universe, that will offer you a beneficial outcome, which is God. And you certainly know that quitting is the wrong thing and will not fix or reduce the suffering, but only keep it alive. Like, if you just logically think, when you're in a conflict, like, bashing and insulting the other person doesn't solve the problem. So really, this concept of faith and acting nobly and ethically, it's really just like a scientific way to reduce people's suffering. Like, you could again set up a hypothesis that behaving nobly or persisting through struggles and not giving up will reduce the variable of suffering, and then you could like do research on it. Like, it's like a solid scientific hypothesis. I mean, it would need to be cleaned up a bit, but it's like it makes sense. It's not some dogmatic bullshit. You know, it's legit. And that's what I really wanted to convey, that this concept of God, faith, and persisting through struggles is like, it's just objectively kind of true. Like, it's not some spiritual wishy-washy thing. It's like objective. Anyway, so in conclusion, giving up and bashing people and insulting people simply prolongs people's suffering and your own suffering, because you do not process your own pain that you feel when you were insulted by the other person. But persisting and trudging through struggle and not giving up is the pathway to redeeming the world from unnecessary suffering and a negative declining trajectory for society. And yeah, and that's, I concluded that by looking into Christianity and God, the concept of God, really. And I think that's what people would understand with by the term faith, in that it is, you have faith that behaving nobly and ethically and morally will produce a good outcome, the best outcome possible given the circumstances, let's say. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. Thank you for listening.